Hi, I'm Richard Jorgensen. I'm your director for Evangelical Mission. And with me today is Dr. Joni Sankin. And Joni, I'd like to invite you to introduce yourself and share a little bit about yourself.
I am a professor of homiletics at United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio, and I live just outside of Dayton with my family. My husband is a Presbyterian pastor, and I have two children, a third grader and a son who just started kindergarten. And I am also a Mennonite pastor. I have not served actively in a church recently. My ministry has mostly been in the seminary setting for the last 12 years or so.
And Joni is going to be partnering with us on our Synod's Bishops' Convocation, as well as our Preaching and Trauma cohort. And Joni, I'd like to invite you to share a little bit of how you became involved with both preaching, but specifically how you became involved with preaching in the midst of trauma.
Thanks. I think trauma is something that Mennonites have done quite a bit of work with. And before I started teaching at United, I was teaching at Eastern Mennonite University down in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And in that context, I felt like there was a lot of natural linking between those sorts of restorative oriented ministries and what we were doing at the seminary. When we moved to Ohio and I started working at United, I felt like students really were not equipped to engage with the things that were unfolding in our world. We have a number of classes that run in intensive formats here. And for a season, it felt like something horrific happened just before students would come for their preaching class to Ohio. We had the Orlando nightclub shooting. And then just a couple days later, students found themselves in Ohio wanting to somehow deal with this. The sermons that they had prepared were inadequate, given what had just unfolded in the previous days. And so I was feeling a stirring that this was work that needed to be done for preachers. And then in the midst of that work, my own family experienced a tragedy. My sister-in-law died suddenly from a brain aneurysm. She was in her 30s. She had very young children. Her death was sudden. The way in which it happened was very traumatic. No one had a chance to say goodbye. And so I then in that instance had a chance to experience being on the receiving end of care following a trauma that happened to our family, and thinking particularly about that dynamic of how do leaders engage with people who have had these experiences. And so that led fairly directly to the writing of Words That Heal. And that book, I very much felt it was almost a gift of the Spirit to have a chance to write that book and to process my experience and to engage. Now I would call it almost a form of compassionate witness, where it was done with intention toward helping others to feel more equipped and less afraid of people who had experienced something serious and traumatic and very stressful in their lives. Following that book came out actually in 2019, and just about a month later, I was thinking, okay, I'm done with this book. I'll work with it, and then I will move on from trauma, was what I was thinking naively. 15 tornadoes hit Dayton, Ohio about a month after this book came out. And no lives were lost, but there was a tremendous amount of damage. And it was as if that tornado had a mind of its own, and it had hit the areas where people were least, had the fewest resources. And so the community was really quite devastated. And then, of course, a couple of months after that, we experienced a mass shooting in Dayton. And again, I had an opportunity to work with pastors around this material. And of course, all of this is unfolding in 2019. And then we move into 2020, and suddenly the whole world is dealing with trauma. And so I'm definitely not done with this material. I feel like it's something that I've continued to feel a lot of calling around engaging with clergy around. And I'm actually working on a second book at this point, tentatively titled All Our Griefs to Bear, which is focused on collective trauma and how those experiences can impact congregations, and what are some practices and tools that leaders can use to help to move their communities toward places of resilience in the midst of this season of trauma.
And Joni, I'm so grateful for your witness and for the way that you're engaged in the public proclamation of the gospel and the public living of the gospel. I'd like to ask, what might people expect if they become part of our cohort as we explore preaching and trauma together?
Well, I'm very excited about being able to have longer, extended conversations over a period of time I think what clergy and other folks can expect would be an opportunity to engage with different nuances of trauma in terms of how it might impact preaching ministry, in particular, looking at scripture. How does Israel and the early church experience trauma? How do we see trauma reflected in scripture? And how do we engage with that in our preaching? How do we deal with the church's own complicity in traumatic events that have happened? And how do we address that through preaching? And then how do we work at collective healing and collective resilience as part of bringing healing in the midst of trauma that's still unfolding in our communities? And then, of course, looking at the person of the preacher and how we care for ourselves and address our own woundedness so that we can live into the call that is on us. I think a lot of congregations, you lead by example. And if you are someone who is processing your own trauma, addressing your own wounds, I think that when one person in a community makes that shift, it can impact the whole community, I think, in a way that's redemptive. I think God works that way through individuals within communities.
Joni, I am so grateful for your witness, so grateful for your ministry. And you have been such a blessing these past months as a partner in this work. And looking forward to our Bishop's Convocation, October 21st, and also the Preaching and Trauma cohort and Preaching and Trauma certificate that will begin in November. And so grateful that God works through you and works through us and among us. Thank you again.
Thank you.